In my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, I argue that the menstrual cycle is an important vital sign that we should be paying attention to. I argue that your menstrual cycle is important regardless of whether or not you're actively trying to have babies now. And I also argue that charting your cycle using fertility awareness method tools is an essential step in truly understanding what's happening in your menstrual cycle. If you haven't grabbed a copy of The Fifth Vital Sign, you can read the first chapter for free over at thefifthvitalsignbook.com. And did you know that you can listen to The Fifth Vital Sign for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/audible for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/audible. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 545. In today's episode, we take a deep dive into endometriosis with Katie Edmonds, endometriosis author, educator, and nutritional therapist. She wrote Heal Endo, an Anti-Inflammatory Approach to Healing From Endometriosis, and the 4-week Endometriosis Diet Plan. She lives in the North Shore of Kauai, next to the biggest mahogany forest in the United States, fun fact, with her loving husband and 2 miracle kiddos. She is absolutely passionate about helping women with endometriosis. You can't cure endometriosis, but she believes with the correct approach, the body can heal in incredible ways. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode with Katie. And I'm so excited to be here today with Katie Edmonds, author of Heal Endo. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. I'm so excited to be here. I was just telling you, I've been a fan of yours for such a long time. So it's fun to just chat on a podcast.
Yeah, for sure. And I was telling you that I was looking for a solid resource to recommend for endo. I mean, there's a lot of different books out there and there's a lot of different approaches. And I was looking for a resource that, obviously acknowledges the medical aspects of treatment, but really gives a roadmap for women to be able to apply as much of the kind of natural approach first. Because as you can imagine, a lot of my clients, the first thing that they want to do isn't necessarily surgery, right? Like there's a lot of women that are
across
really
the board.
To that. Yeah.
Yeah.
For good reason. That's a bit I want to get into all the things. But before we go into a lot of the technical things, I would just love to hear your story. Why did you write this book? Was this something that affected you personally?
Yes. Yeah. I had endometriosis really terribly for a long time. I was really lucky to be diagnosed early. I had pain. It came on really fast and hard, actually, during sex. And I thought my uterus had exploded, right? I'm 23 and I've never experienced pain like that. And my doctors took the pain really seriously. That's not every woman's journey. And they're like, you need to get this checked out. It sounds like endometriosis. And I was like, absolutely not. I looked up endometriosis. It's period pain. I don't have period pain. I just had an exploded uterus. Maybe it's cancer. I was, very confident it wasn't endo, which I was so thankful for, because when I had Googled it, the tagline of endo is there's no cure. And this is even longer now, I forget, maybe nearing 18 years. So it was like those old fashioned blogs, like those old WordPress blogs. And there was 2 or 3 endometriosis blogs, and it chronicles these women's lives of absolute despair. And I was like, okay, well, I don't have period pain. Thank God I don't have to have that incurable, horrible disease, endometriosis. Bam, I get diagnosed with endometriosis, and I just was devastated, because there's the whole thing that women are still getting. There's no cure. There's nothing you can do. You can just manage symptoms. And my symptoms were so life altering, and they came on so quickly. I was like, how am I supposed to live with this for the rest of my life? I thought with cancer, you could treat it, right? Because that's what you think of when you think of things like cancer, autoimmune. But then for me, it sounded like there was no treatment. So my life kind of devolved after that. I was a very fit, very athletic young woman. I loved to have lots of fun, maybe a little too much fun. But it was all of a sudden I was in so much pain all the time. I couldn't run. I couldn't do anything that jolted my body. I actually would feel my uterus inside of me, which was more just the inflammation inside my peritoneal cavity. I had 2 surgeries, and I could never afford a professional excision surgery that's so pushed. I live in the state of Hawaii. There's not a single excision specialist here. So when I was reaching on a mainland, they're $50,000, right? And then you also have to fly and stay in a hotel for a few weeks. So I just felt stuck against a wall. Like, okay, there's nothing I can do for endo. And I was pretty hopeless. I was, I was kind of, it was in a great place for me at that time. And my husband and I, I was 29, 30, and we wanted to start a family, and I wasn't getting pregnant. And this is when I just started getting really mad about the disease, because I did everything the doctor said. And then, I did the birth control, I did these surgeries. They're telling me I only had like mild to moderate endometriosis. I wasn't a stage 4 case, but I still had this pain. I wasn't getting pregnant. And it was almost the anger at the situation that led me to research it correctly. And I had just been on things like Healthline, or, these generic searches, or looking up, the holistic side of stuff, which is also sincere. Sincere is the Western medical side, but it was completely wrong too, as, doing these cleanses are going to fix you because it's a liver issue, it's an estrogen issue. So it was all wrong. It's, endometriosis is an inflammatory disease, and I had no idea. So for years I'd been trying to lower my estrogen, cleanse my liver, like, doing the pharmaceuticals they told me to do, and to actually find out that it behaves more like autoimmune or cancer. And I thought back, well, I know that those are treated. People treat those all the time and put them into remission. Why could I not treat endometriosis similarly and aim for that? And it's one of those moments that shifted everything in my perspective. I changed everything I was doing. It's like I was throwing pounds of mud at the wall to see what would stick. And I moved yards and started, a whole different type of mud. Like, let's try this approach of really re-regulating the immune system in every single way possible, through reversing nutrient deficiencies rather than axing foods, through walking and like physical therapy rather than intense HIIT classes or just being exhausted. And slowly my endometriosis went into remission. And I didn't know that was possible. My symptoms were completely gone. I ended up getting pregnant after 3 years of unexplained infertility. I now have 2 kids that were conceived naturally. I was very lucky for that. And I say at the age of 39, I'm healthier than I was 10, 15, 20 years ago, because I laid this groundwork that allowed for my body to heal from within. So because of all of that, I started to ask myself, am I an anomaly? When you go and you look online in the endometriosis world, it's very dark, still very dark. There's so many accounts, just there's no cure, there's no hope, this is your life forever. So when I started digging into the research and saying, like, does this work for other people? It was like a resounding yes across the board. There's so many women with endometriosis who go on to reclaim their lives. They obviously don't stay in the endometriosis community. They're not there, they move forward. But in the research, it's there. It's showing that stopping the inflammation, stopping the progression of endo is possible. And it can just take many different approaches. This is the integrative thing, where you do include surgery and pharmaceuticals when needed, but you also integrate Eastern medicine, which can be amazingly helpful, and diet and lifestyle, which is almost mandatory for any chronic disease, right? They're not caused by diet and lifestyle solely, but they can be healed through the process of diet and lifestyle, along with these other factors. So the integrative approach is what the book is about. It explains endometriosis and how to actually get better, rather than being me at 23 crying, thinking this was it for the rest of my life.
Well, I mean, thank you for taking us through that. That's a lot of years that you took us through in a short time. And I mean, what you described, it's terrifying. And I think that it's natural to have that resistance to this diagnosis of like, what do you mean I have this big, scary condition?
Mm-hmm.
I think that I'm sure that anyone who's listening who kind of tuned into this episode because we're going to put the title of endometriosis somewhere in the title might have gone through that herself, where it was like, no, that can't be what I have.
I speak to people to this day that don't want to get a diagnosis. And their thing is, there's nothing you can do, so why get diagnosed? Which is a good question if you don't think there's anything you can do, but endo is absolutely treatable. So that's where I hope we can flip the script, so to speak, that it's not such a terrifying thing to get. It's like you want to diagnose it so you can treat it early on as fast as you can, because the earlier you catch it, the less damage can occur, and then you treat the disease.
Mm-hmm. And there's so much around the diagnosis. I mean, there's research showing that on average, it takes anywhere from 8 to 12 years. That study that was done in the UK and the States. And so many people are totally shocked by that. But then you had I feel like you had a fairly unique experience. I mean, I don't know if unique, I'm sure there's other women who might have had that experience too, but a lot of the women I've spoken to, when they experience severe pain and they go to their practitioners, especially if it's period pain, not necessarily taken seriously. And many don't even hear the word endometriosis. They haven't ever even heard of it for many years. Could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned that it started with pain with sex, but it sounds like you also had like kind of periodic pain a lot. So could you share a little bit about what your pain experience was like?
Yeah. So my endometriosis will be different from everyone else's endometriosis because there's so many different types, but it was pain with deep penetration only at certain times of the month. So there was the acute pain, but then I also ended up getting a kind of a diffuse pain throughout my pelvis almost all the time. And that was caused mostly by the inflammation. Although at the time I was blaming it on the lesions. I had this big habit to blame everything on lesions, but it was actually the inflammatory response happening in my peritoneal cavity it was like tender to the touch. So I had that almost all the time. And ovulation pain. And then I had more of an acute pain in the cul-de-sac area, which is the area behind the uterus. It's also called the pouch of Douglas. Like, I don't know who Douglas is or why they named this woman's body part after him. But the cul-de-sac's a little nicer. It's like the little pouch behind in between the rectum and the uterus, where I did have endometriosis lesions. So there was some acute pain, there's some diffuse pain. For me, I had pain a lot of the time, except during my period. So I just started my period half an hour ago. And I'm like, that's because I'm going to talk to Lisa. My body was like, all right, we're starting.
Nice.
But I have zero pain with periods. And I never have, no matter how bad my endo. It was like pain all these other times. So that's something about endo that can be one of the reasons why there's such a delay in diagnosis, is because so many doctors know about it as period pain, which also shows how insane it is if you're going to the doctor for severe period pain to the point you feel like you're dying or you're throwing up, and they still don't even mention it. I don't know who those doctors are, but I too hear those stories. So they are out there. But for a lot of us, we have, I'd call them weird symptoms, but they shouldn't be weird. It should be, if a woman is coming in with pain that's cyclical, it should be considered, endometriosis should be absolutely considered as a possibility, because you can have endo and just have ovulatory pain, or you can have pain the 2 days before your period or a few days after. The thing to tune into is if it does have to do with your cycle, something like diaphragmic pain during your period or around that time, right? That could signal something like diaphragm endo. All these different, factors play into the disease. And the other thing is that you can have no period pain and have more digestive issues or digestive pain, which is why so many women actually get diagnosed with IBS, either misdiagnosed, and then so they put off their endometriosis diagnosis because they think it's only digestive in nature. So it's kind of a mix of my pain and then the different types of pain that just exist out there. There's such a wide variety of pains that someone can have. It's part of the big problem of endometriosis is the variety of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, for someone who's kind of maybe newer to this issue, could you describe a little bit about what it is? You mentioned the lesions and you mentioned the inflammation. I mean, I think even for myself, I think one of the things I often talk about is that obviously there's certain characteristics of endometriosis, whether it be the pain, the severe pain with periods, or it being kind of unspecified pelvic pain at different times, or being pain with sex. But as you mentioned, it all depends on where it is, what's going on, because there can be other symptoms that are just, like you said, shouldn't be weird, but weird symptoms.
Yeah.
But there's also women who have severe stage 4 endo with no pain.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. There's silent endo, it's referred to, and that's women who have endometriosis and have zero symptoms, like no gastrointestinal issues, no any types of symptoms. Then there's the women who have, like, I call them normal symptoms. Like maybe they have some pain on the first day of their period, but it's nothing like some ibuprofen can't take care of. So it's more like, oh, I have bad cramps, but it can be endometriosis is way worse than this. So I can walk you through the stages of endometriosis because I think it is a really important thing to understand for people that have it. I know I did, I thought endo was like this thing that I got. I didn't understand it. It was sort of like cancer to me. Like you just get cancer. Like, I don't know where it comes from, but it's not normal. And I'd almost think it's not a human cell, but it's actually like a mutated human cell. So endometriosis is very much the same. And developing endometriosis doesn't mean you all of a sudden have a lesion, which is an active endometriosis implant in your body. It is this really long process that starts with the creation of an endo-like cell. So if you've heard these cells are similar to an endometrial cell, but different, they absolutely are. They're very similar, but their differences lie in that they're genetically and epigenetically altered. So they're behaving radically different. Because there's so many different types of endometriosis, 65 and counting, the type of endo kind of just depends on the cell partially. Like, is it really sensitive to estrogen, or is it not sensitive to estrogen at all? Is it slightly progesterone resistant, or does it have zero progesterone receptors? Right? So there's all these different factors, like how aggressive is it? It even has to do some with the pain. Like some endometriosis is really associated with pain and some isn't. But all these factors play into the creation of endo-like cell, and then it's placed outside of your body. So some women can be born with an endo-like cell already placed outside of the uterus. Other research shows that it's possible to have these cells, you actually have endo-like cells within the uterus. So if you go into the endometrial lining of endometriosis sufferers and analyze the endometrial lining, they can look like an endo-like cell. They're already there. So then thanks to retrograde menstruation, they could seed the peritoneal cavity. So there's two different theories on that, already outside the uterus. Inside the uterus, it's kind of been seen as research, both are possible, which is why endo can develop from different processes in different people. But the really interesting thing about the research is it shows that just having an endo-like cell does not mean you're going to develop an endometriosis lesion. This is again, the activated endometriosis inside of you. You can have endometriosis-like cells stay in your body and never cause any problems, which is fascinating. There was research that about 10% of fetuses were born with an endo-like cell in that deep cul-de-sac area, but only 4% developed endometriosis there. So in that case, it was 60% of cases were actually prevented. So what causes the lesion to develop? Well, it's your immune system. It's actually an immune attack and also a misguided inflammatory immune attack. So there's ample amounts of immune dysfunction. Just like an autoimmune disorder or a cancer, your immune system is doing things it shouldn't, such as taking the endo-like cell that the immune system is responsible for taking out. Like it's saying, you are a mutated, deformed, really weird cell. You don't belong here. I'm going to dispose of you. But it doesn't just leave it there. It actually establishes blood supply, nerve supply. Now it has oxygen, it has nutrients, and it's actually a living, breathing part of your body. And once this happens, you have endometriosis officially. So then this lesion can grow depending on, a variety of factors, including how much inflammation is around, the type of endometriosis. It is a whole process that depends on your body. It's your body's cell that's been mutated, your body that established it, and your body's immune response can possibly or potentially progress it. So the hope lies in the fact that this process, which I refer to as endoing, because I don't believe endometriosis should be a noun, something you get, it should be a verb, because it is a process continually unfolding in your body. It doesn't just move one direction. That research shows in humans from a wide variety of studies that actually went into humans and looked through surgery or imaging. But for this I'm talking about surgery, I'm talking about lesions, not just endometriomas, that on average, 30% of endometriosis cases appear to progress. And this is what you don't want, right? Progression of endometriosis means the lesions are growing bigger, or they're causing damage, scar tissue or adhesions, or they're spreading throughout the body. So you don't want progression. But equally, 30% of the lesions stabilized, meaning they did not grow or cause problems. Maybe they were symptomatic, but they weren't causing damage. And moreover, 40% regress. They are in the shrinking stage because endometriosis can grow or regress or stabilize. It's not just one direction. So you actually have 70%, you're more likely to stabilize or regress with endometriosis than progress. And that's what I say our goal needs to be when you have this disease, to say, we need to treat it. We need to do everything we can so that your body stops endoing. Like, we need to stop the processes inside your body that are fueling the progression of endometriosis as much as possible. And depending where you are and the type of endometriosis, yes, maybe you will need a surgery. Some women 100% need surgery. I never had a professional surgery. So I'm kind of on that side saying, not everyone needs one. Like, you can find a really happy medium without one, but it's taking all the tools in the toolbox. And this is where holistic and integrative stuff shines, because it's what allows us to stop the endoing. When we know the things that progress endometriosis, which I talk at length in my book, we have bacteria, we have sex hormones, yes, but stress hormones appear to almost affect endometriosis more in some cases. So those stress hormones, really looking at the nervous system, looking at sleep, looking at nutrient deficiencies, at movement, all of these things go into, are we going to be endoing or are we going to be not endoing? And we want to kind of slash that progression direction.
Mm-hmm. There's so much that you said there that is different to what kind of the mainstream, like you were talking about, like the mainstream narrative about endometriosis is that there's no cure, there's nothing you can do, and we just have to manage the pain or cut it out or whatever. And so what you're saying is really, it's really interesting, and it makes sense when you said to say it as a verb instead of a noun, because obviously there are women out there who have found a way to successfully eradicate their symptoms. It doesn't necessarily happen the same way for everybody, right? Some women are able to do it through diet, different like the kind of changes that you mentioned, the holistic changes only. Some women must do a combination of that, surgery or whatever the case. But based on the fact that that has happened and it does happen, it would indicate that there should be a way to kind of stop it. So I think one of the things I found really interesting when researching endo is one of the things that you said, which is that it does act like cancer in a way. It's described that way specifically because it's almost like dare I say, like a parasite. Like I know that that's not what it is. So I'm not anyone who's like,
you can watch out in the holistic circle saying parasite.
Don't yell at me on the internet or whatever. But I'm saying like it establishes, it kind of takes up shop in your body, builds a little home there. It sets up, it has the blood vessels, like it really sets up shop in your body, establishes itself, and then has its own, bloodlines and ways to get nutrients. So that's really concerning if you think about it, right? So
I call it's like a living, breathing part of your body. And, we have all of these bodily systems. We have the circulatory system, the lymphatic system, all the systems of the entire body. And once you have established endometriosis, if it has been established for a while, I say it almost becomes another bodily system because all of your systems interact and respond to each other, right? Like your circulatory system does not circulate on its own. It depends on, your respiratory system and your muscular system, et cetera. And then they depend on each other. So you cannot just isolate one system alone. So endometriosis is affected by all those systems. One reason why it's a full body disease, and another reason why we have so much control over quite a bit of our endometriosis. They say stop endoing as much as possible, but conversely, it starts to affect the other systems. So if it's been around for a while, you can have urinary tract issues. Like so many women have issues with their bladder or with their urinary tract. The digestive system can become affected. If you have, inflammation through that peritoneal cavity, it can cause a lot of issues. Even things like the lymphatic system and the muscular system of, the pelvic floor. So it does start to feed and respond. It's like a conversation that's going on. And the longer that's been going on is probably the more integrative care someone is going to need to rehabilitate their body back to health, because the systems they forget how to function optimally. Just the pelvic floor alone, right, can become totally atrophied, totally stuck, and you need tons of rehab just for the pelvic floor, not to mention things like the microbiome and the nervous system. So yes, that's exactly it. It really makes a home, and then it becomes a part of the body conversation.
And you mentioned retrograde menstruation, which in the research seems to be the primary explanation that is provided for how it happens. So the concept that you have these endometrial-like cells, and then through this kind of the menstruation kind of going in different directions, it causes this. Now, I guess the question out of it is from your research and your understanding, what are some of the reasons that you think this happens? I think I feel like it has to be more complicated than that, because when people have endo lesions like in their brain and all over the body, it's like, did the menstrual blood go up? You know what I mean? So there has to be more. And one other thing that I'll say is, years ago, I did an interview, and this interview was with a group of researchers. Well, I interviewed, I think, the head researcher of the paper, but there was a group of researchers that did this paper, and the topic in general was hair products and how hair products for Black women in particular have all these chemicals. But one of the things that came up in this conversation was this concept of, if you're a woman and you're pregnant with a female, like you're pregnant with your little girl, and you're exposed to toxins while her endometrium is developing, for example, that there's certain things that could go awry and that could predispose her to endo. So I would love to hear your thoughts, because I think there has to be multifactorial disease here.
So endometriosis is multifactorial, like any chronic disease. And retrograde menstruation is an incredibly contentious thing to talk about in the endometriosis realm. And the reason why it became contentious in the first place was because doctors were using it as an excuse. I never had a doctor do this, but doctors have been accused of saying that if your uterus is the fault, your uterus is like spewing endometrial stem cells into the peritoneal cavity, and therefore we need to take out the uterus or stop period. So that's the thing. Okay, retrograde menstruation is causing this. Let's stop the period, which is the root cause of the issue, right? Your eyes are so big because it's like that is a huge problem. And we do see fetuses being born with Mullerian defects, which is where there's little endometrial cells misplaced. So you touched on a number of things. You're so highly educated about all of this. The fact is, it looks like in research, this is in my opinion, in research, that you can have the cells mutated, and that could be inside your uterus, or they could be outside. And with Mullerian defects, which is when you have, the uterine lining outside, those could be totally normal. Those could be just normal endometrial cells, or they could be the genetically altered ones. Like you're saying, it could be a grandmother exposed to dioxins. It could be that, and it really altered those cells. We see inflammation actually change the behavior of these stem cells. So whenever you have stem cells put into a storm of inflammatory immune factors, it changes. So my book it changes basically from like a quaint fertility beacon nurse to a like rogue superhero that's ready to fight for its life, and it will establish where it wants. It's going to fight normal cellular death. So all of a sudden it doesn't die. It can become very estrogen sensitive and very progesterone resistant. And this is just from inflammation. So there's all these things, right? Like what if you have like a slightly abnormal endometrial cell that was placed in your deep cul-de-sac when you were growing as a fetus, but it didn't cause any trouble until you got something like pelvic inflammatory disease or an STD. And this happens, women say they feel their endometriosis came on super fast after they had an enormous inflammatory issue. And it could have been the cells were lying in wait, potentially. That's one way. There's the bacterial contamination theory that explains that, just how much the inflammation from a bacterial infection can change those cells. So conversely, you can potentially, the research is out there that you may not have had an endo-like cell before you were born, but because of things like inflammation and exposure to chemicals, which in my book I detail all the chemicals associated with changing these cells, because they were human, they were a normal endometrial cell at one point. So what shifted them, namely chemicals and inflammation. And they, depending on your own special cocktail of ancestral heritage, cellular placement, and lifestyle, that you develop endometriosis. Now, a lot of it is, so it can be spread similar to cancer, like the circulatory system or the lymphatic system. So there's having endo in the brain or on the diaphragm. It spreads throughout the body. This is like the initial cell. But there's research I was looking at of a woman who had an endometrial lesion like inside her liver, that somehow the endometrial cell during her development as a fetus was just placed incorrectly in her liver. There was no endo anywhere else in her body, but she had active endometriosis inside her liver. So it was one of those anomalies, and it's been found in men. So this is one of those things that it can, an anomaly during the fetal development can place tissue where it shouldn't be. So it's very rarely found in men. I think it's like 5 cases or something, maybe a few more than that. So it's not like 1% of men have it. It's super, super rare. But it goes to show that you don't need a uterus to have it. Women born without uteruses have also been born with it. And it could just develop through a variety of different factors. So online, it's very contentious to even mention retrograde menstruation. I mentioned like the bacterial contamination thing, and I got like trounced by trolls because they just hate that. But the energy is put on the wrong thing. Like, it is not about we should never stop research. I'm absolutely against canceling what research is positing, because this research is so cool. It helps us understand our disease. What we need to stop is doctors saying, remove your uterus, because maybe you have endometrial like cells inside your uterus, but like that makes no difference. If you want a baby, what you want to do is try to epigenetically alter those cells so that they can then host the pregnancy that you desire, right? So it's not taking out the uterus. It's saying, where does your problem stem from? And how can we help you get the quality of life in the future you desire?
In my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, I argue that the menstrual cycle is an important vital sign that we should be paying attention to. I argue that your menstrual cycle is important regardless of whether or not you're actively trying to have babies now. And I also argue that charting your cycle using fertility awareness method tools is an essential step in truly understanding what's happening in your menstrual cycle. If you haven't grabbed a copy of The Fifth Vital Sign, you can read the first chapter for free over at thefifthvitalsignbook.com. And did you know that you can listen to The Fifth Vital Sign for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/audible for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/audible. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. I mean, just so powerful, because it's moving away from, like you said, endometriosis is something that you get toward an understanding of what's actually happening in the body. And so there's some sort of process, some sort of insult that is causing the cells to mutate and change, the cells that were already in your body, and they're now behaving differently, and they're kind of taking up shop and all the things. So I really appreciate going through all that, because again, this is very different to what we typically hear about it. And also perhaps because of just the kind of preconceived notions about it, maybe just not that many people are looking into it as deeply. Like when it affects you personally, when you can see how many women, it's really terrifying when you look at the stats on endo and how pervasive it is, how high the prevalence of it is. And we don't know the scary number, because many women have it and don't necessarily know it. And who knows what percentage of women who have it are not even diagnosed. So I don't even think we understand nearly the extent of it. It's serious. And I personally think it's probably not getting better in our world full of chemicals and all the things. Like our lifestyle factors are not in line with what needs to stop this.
Lifestyle factors are absolutely a huge contributor to this disease, like 100%. You know, that's in the research very definitively when it comes to chronic inflammation and the altering of these cell behaviors. That is true. And I mean, Dr. Dan Martin, he's now the executive director of Endometriosis Foundation of America. He supposes, based on research, this isn't in research, that it's more between 20 and potentially up to 30% of women actually have endometriosis. But what you could say is it's incidental, because we know that endometriosis does not affect everyone terribly. And that is what is so fascinating about this disease, that they did, where was it? I think in South America somewhere, women were getting their tubes tied to prevent pregnancy. So they already had successful pregnancies enough that they are now trying to prevent future pregnancies. And 6% of those women actually had incidental endometriosis. So endometriosis that was there, they didn't know they had endometriosis, and it wasn't causing problems. So it wasn't causing the fusing of the ovaries together. It wasn't stuck to the abdominal wall. Like it was just there being endometriosis. And so that kind of goes in line with that 60% that's either stabilized or regressed. So the question is like, what is the special mixture of things that's going to allow endometriosis to potentially exist in harmony with us? Like I have no idea what my endometriosis lesions are doing. I know they're there. Like I never had a professional excision surgery. So they were there. I'm assuming they're still there, but they, you know, and every exam, it's like my uterus moves, like my ovaries are in the right place. You know, you can do basic palpitations, look for places that have pain with an exam, and it appears to have, you know, zero symptoms going on. So the goal then being, if endometriosis is affecting so many women, but a smaller percentage of them have really, really bad endo, we need to start looking at the absolute differences. And I think some of it falls into the category of, and it's just like cancer, like the things that you can do to prevent cancer are very similar to things you can do to prevent things like a bad endometriosis. And I think as research goes on, hopefully we'll be able to see that. And with new technology, because it's really exciting, the technology that's coming out now, an MRI, they're looking at that they can see deep endometriosis now, because before, and still for most of us, just today, you'll have to have a laparoscopy. So you have to have a surgery to see if you have endometriosis, which is like so many women don't do that. And so many doctors doing the surgeries don't even know what they're looking for, which is really frustrating. So you can do the surgery and say, they tell you don't have endo, but you do. But with the new type of technology, you'll be able to do an MRI and see deep lesions. And they're just working on how to see superficial lesions. So the really cool thing about that is you could be able to track it, right? Like if you have aggressive endo, you don't want to guess, right? You want to say, okay, I'm going to do diet and lifestyle factors. Is that going to help my endo? But you go back and you get an MRI 6 months later and it's like moving or progressing. You say, okay, I'm a great candidate for surgery. I'm going to go get that removed and then continue to lower these triggers without it progressing. That's going to open up so many doors for women who because right now you have no idea what's going on inside your body without a surgery. And I'm really excited for that. Also blood tests for endo coming out, urine tests, menstrual blood sampling. So there's all these things that I look at my daughter who is, she is so, endo comes from my mom's side and my dad's side. So it's like, all right, Nola, we'll see what happens. But my hope is in 10 years, you'll have a lot of options to like test and see what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, those are some exciting options, because that's a barrier for a lot of women who just don't want the surgery, but would potentially benefit from the diagnosis. I'm of the opinion that it is helpful, even though it can be difficult to actually get that information of a yes or no. And like you said, there's challenges in that, because even women who do get the surgery for the diagnosis could have like you said, like it's just, it's really challenging. But with that said, when a person gets that diagnosis, for many women, that is the catalyst for what they're going to do next. Whereas you can't be in denial anymore. So now you actually have to do something about it. So let's talk a little bit about, everyone will have to go and get your book, Heal Endo, for like the full story, right? But share with us, for women who, let's say they do have active symptoms and a lot of pain, what are some of the things that they can do as a first step?
In my book, I say the first step is nutrition. And I say that because it's often like the lowest hanging fruit. But then I realize like for some people, it's the last thing they want to deal with. And maybe it's movement first or whatever. But I like diet because it affects so many of our bodily systems while just focusing on what you eat. So you can affect the nervous system through blood sugar dysregulation, right? Getting that under control. You lower your systemic and localized inflammation levels just by eating more antioxidants. You reduce all of your symptoms through increasing your nutrient intake, right? Because women with endometriosis are found to be incredibly deficient in a really wide variety of vitamins and minerals. The vitamins and minerals that are essential for reproduction. They're essential for quelling period pain, right? They're essential for nervous system regulation. So it's like, if you're trying to do these things, but you don't have the ingredients for it, you're not going to be able to do that. So reversing nutrient deficiencies, lowering inflammation, like all those things I just mentioned without reiterating it. I think diet is an awesome tool. Unfortunately, it's kind of like that old-fashioned endo diet. I do still see people recommending that or saying, well, diet didn't help me because I cut out 100 different foods, developed orthorexia, and didn't help. So the Heal Endo approach, the approach I talk about, is an antioxidant and nutrient-dense diet that focuses on nutrient inclusion before exclusion. And because of all the foods that you're going to be including, it often naturally excludes a lot of the foods that are the nutrient poor, blood sugar spiking foods. So you just focus on what you are going to eat, and that includes a lot of what you guys talk about in your fertility book. It's a really similar, right? You're building a body to carry pregnancy, the same thing of rebuilding a body to crawl out of the chronic disease pit. Like you need so many nutrients, it might seem unbelievable. But the focus being on things like the magnesium, the zinc, the EPA and DHA, phytonutrients. The book lists, I have the Endo 9, so 9 different nutrients that can really help. And if you look on some of the reviews I have a diet book as well on Amazon, you'll see some of the 5-star reviews are like, this absolutely changed my life. Like I had my first pain-free period ever, and I can't even believe this, or I got pregnant. So those are the people that diet really, really affects. But diet is not something, I think people can be too controlling of it. Like they feel some improvements and then they keep thinking, well, I need to do the next thing. And they're the ones who are like, I'm going to do the keto thing and I'm going to do the carnivore because the more I control my diet, the better. And with endometriosis being a chronic illness, that you want to be really gentle with yourself, and it's going to be a lifestyle that you carry on for the next, hopefully, like 60 years, right? However old you are listening to this. So you have to do the slow and steady thing. And I like to say, once you have your diet pretty dialed, then you can move forward. Like you're feeling a little bit better, adding in movement. The nervous system thing is huge for so many of us. I've kind of over talked about it on so many of my previous podcasts, but there's the most enormous aspect, I think, that prevents healing, and it's the nervous system dysfunction. And this is for the women who have been stuck spinning your wheels, or you get one thing under control and 2 months later it's back. And you just, maybe your motto is my body hates me, or I'm just falling apart. That is often associated with the nervous system dysfunction. So retraining the brain, not through talk therapy, because that's actually not helpful when you already have a lot of issues going on. You don't actually keep talking about those issues. You retrain your brain to see the generosity, the joy, the hope, or even the neutrality without feeling those negative emotions. And you have to start retraining your body to live like that every day. And you can have these profound healing, either openings, like suddenly your SIBO treatment works, as you know, you're on your 5th SIBO treatment and finally it sticks, or you feel your pain, dissolve from a level 10 to a level 5. So those are really easy things. And then, I mean, it's even simple things, right? Like sleeping, like getting really quality sleep that so many people do because they're binge watching Netflix, as like all Americans do. But when there's really easy wins, I say, like, sometimes we think we have this insurmountable disease that's endometriosis, but then you think, well, what processes am I doing that I know in my life I could change? And what if I just did a few of those and tick them off over the next few months? I'm going to stop watching my late night TV and I'm just going to go to bed and like get 8 hours of solid sleep. Like, how do you feel? Like, I'm going to start eating blood sugar balanced food. Wow, I'm actually feeling a lot better. Who knew I could affect my lesions, or the symptoms just by doing these things. So yeah, in my book, I have like the low hanging fruit list in the last chapter, like just do the bare minimum if you're really overwhelmed. And from there, move on to things like if you actually do have a gut infection, like you're definitely going to have to get that addressed. We often have reproductive tract infections. I mean, the dysbiosis in the reproductive tract of a woman with endometriosis can be crazy. And nearly all of us have dysbiosis. So from not too wild to like pretty wild. So that's a huge thing to address, but you can really start minimally and see how the body recalibrates from there. Mm-hmm. I'm a fan of bite-sized pieces.
Well, I feel like bite-sized pieces are kind of the only thing that works with actual humans because we're already busy, right? We already have a zillion things to do. So it can't just be like, and today I'm going to change my entire life, my whole diet, my entire exercise.
And that's why that holds people back, because I think that like, I see that I'm doing all these things. I don't know where to start. And it's like, you really just start with one thing.
Yeah. Well, I can ask you a gazillion questions. So I have a few more so I don't keep you until tomorrow. But I wanted to ask a little bit about the movement piece of it, because I've heard various things from women over the years, as you can imagine, related to movement. And I've heard a lot of women say that when they exercise, around their period, before their period, I've heard some women say that, my pain is a lot less when I exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also worked with women who feel just the need to exercise regardless of what's going on. And so they'll kind of push themselves to like do heavy workouts when they're fully bleeding on like day 1 or 2 of their period. So maybe share your take on the movement piece.
Yeah, I mean, movement in the endometriosis realm, you just have to take any advice you hear with a grain of salt based on your experience. So you can run and have a very active weightlifting lifestyle if that's not affecting your disease, right? Or affecting your inflammation levels. But what research shows about movement is really cool. That movement it quells endometriosis pain more than painkillers. And some women would like be shocked at that and be like, no, movement is what flares my disease. So I think there's a really big difference in what we all think exercise and movement is. So I read, do you know Katie Bowman? She's a biomechanic.
I've heard of her name. It's familiar.
She's great. She's all about natural movement. And
Oh,
this
you know
is
what? I think I do. I think a friend of mine recommended her stuff once.
yeah,
So that's why that's
she'd be fun
familiar.
on your podcast. But I had read a blog of hers and she was saying how she started walking 3 to 5 miles a day and her period cramps were totally gone. And this is during my active healing phase. And I'm like, I'm open to anything. Okay, I'm going to start walking, because I would always push myself to do these like nuts workout. Gabby Reese lives on the North Shore of Kauai and she leads these like really crazy workouts. I'm like, I'm just going to do those. And I would just be like flat out for days after. I'm just so tired, so inflamed, be like, I'll crawl back to it next week. So that was my idea of exercise. And I'm like, well, I can't exercise anymore. But like introducing walking and alignment into my life is what absolutely shifted things. Because when we have the issues like pelvic floor dysfunction and really terrible core strength and breathing problems, so many of us breathe from our stomach rather than our ribs. And we're told to. We're saying, oh, that's how you relax. You breathe through your stomach. Like, well, that's how you relax when you're laying down, but you don't see an athlete, before they're going to run their Olympic sprint, like letting their belly just hang out. They don't, because they have this core strength and they're actually using the intercostal muscles of the ribs. The ribs are what open and allow your diaphragm to expand and slightly lower and then go up. So, sorry, I bonked the microphone. But in my book, I talk about some tests that you could do to see if you have core dysfunction. And I think that should guide you more than anything if you should do high intensity exercise. So we could actually do it right now, because it's kind of fun. If anyone is listening to a podcast in the car, you can do this test. So the first one is the inhale. I'm assuming everyone is sitting up, so you should be having an active core at this point. If you can stand up and then take a deep breath. You might need to do it a few times until you can see, is that breath going, is it sticking in your chest? Is it going into your ribs and you feel like your back kind of opening a little bit and the sides of your intercostals, or is it going into straight your tummy? So where it should be going is your intercostals. That is why you have ribs and your lungs are within your ribs. Your muscles of your rib cage should open very easily. And just slightly, I'm not talking about it, your entire rib cage is flaring out like Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's very mild, but you wouldn't see your tummy moving at all. So if you saw your tummy moving or nothing moved, you're just in your chest, that is like a dysfunctional breathing pattern on your inhale. Now, if you exhale, you can do this through coughing or sneezing, but something I kind of like to do is pretend like you're blowing petals off of a flower. So take your big deep breath and blow as hard as you can and put your hand on your tummy and see what it does. Now, if your tummy goes in that was good, a very forceful, get those petals off. If your tummy goes in, that's great, because your abdominals were bracing with that pressure as the air went out of your body. If your tummy bulged, well, those are your organs. That's not air. Your organs are pushing out of your tummy, right? The air is in your lungs. The air is going out of your lungs into the world. Your organs were like the floor, and your diaphragm was stomping on your organs. So this is imperative to understand when your uterus, your ovaries, and probably your endometriosis lesions lie at the bottom of 11 pounds of organs down there. So retroverted uterus, tipped uterus, weirdly placed uterus. How did that happen? A lot of that can be from the pressure of all your organs constantly pounding on it. So that was one breath out. Now, what happens when you run? Right? Pound, pound, pound. Well, hello, pelvic floor dysfunction. Hello, pounding on that poor uterus at the bottom of your abdominal cavity. Weightlifting, squats. Prolapse is happening more and more for women who don't even have babies, because there's so much inflammation that can happen right there. So we need to be super careful of how we exercise and move depending on our core function. I luckily have a very good program I can recommend that fixes this, because I would hate to bring it up and say, okay, now you're on your own, you got to retrain that. Because the way to retrain that is similar to almost neuroplasticity. You have to practice it on your off moments, and eventually your body will remember it when you need it most. And the training is called hypopressive training. And there's a woman who trained me on all of this. Her name is Dr. Angie Mueller. She'd also be a cool podcast person to have on. And she's at Core Recovery pt.com, or it's the corerecoverymethod.com. And you can reach out to her. I also have this in my book, so there's more about core function and dysfunction. But, so many of us in the endo world, we talk about, oh, my lower tummy is so bloated, it never goes away no matter how much I work out. I have to wear Spanx. And I do believe a good number of those people have pretty significant core dysfunction. And of course, that would flare during exercise. So rehabilitating the body so you can exercise again. But it's also why things like walking and swimming are excellent, because they're really low pressure activities. So if you have terrible core dysfunction, like walk your heart out, swim your heart out, and then do your hypopressive training on the side.
That is just so fascinating. I mean, there's just so much to this. You've really done a lot of specialized work in this area. I feel like we should all be thanking you for the amount of effort and time and research that you've put into it.
Thank you.
Often people will say things like around the fertility awareness rabbit hole, right? Because I've been in there for a long time. And they'll say, you just have assembled so much hard to find information. And I feel like you've really done that with Endo. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it took almost 3 years to write the book, and that was like research and writing it. So it was a very big labor of love, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we start wrapping up, could you, I can ask you a couple of questions. I think I'll wrap it into one, but for the listeners, maybe share what you feel are the top takeaways for them, and then tell us a little bit more about your book and where people can find you and all the things that you are doing.
Okay, so I'll try to keep it short. I think one of the best things you can do if you have endometriosis before you create a treatment plan or grab your next supplement is learn about the disease, how it works, and take control of that information. Because we've so much have, exported that reliance on people like doctors or certain social media people that we follow. And a lot of them have very strong opinions of what is right and what is wrong. And to come at it with, this is actually how the disease behaves. And now I'm going to work knowing my own body, because my type of endometriosis can be different from the type of patients this person is working with. Or, it doesn't respond well to this thing like acupuncture that this one person is really pushing, but it does respond really well to things like pelvic floor or physical therapy. So putting the power back in your hands is like a two-pronged approach, understanding what the disease is and how it's affecting your body. And that gives you radical hope. And that is what you also, you want to maintain that forever. Don't follow any accounts that are going to tell you there's no cure and just going to languish in how awful the disease is. Don't put your energy there or your time. I would say if you're going to have extra time, spend it on making your life better and your body healthier and more resilient. And it can be in so many different ways, right? It can be reading your book. Like I say, it was my fertility struggles that actually was my silver lining, because I realized I was sick as could be. Like, of course I couldn't get pregnant. I was so nutrient deprived, so stressed, but it took me having to think outside of the box to reframe my endometriosis, to realize, oh, that's actually affecting my endometriosis. I didn't realize like just being this unhealthy could affect it. So that's kind of I think that would be the one thing, learn about the disease and how it's affecting you, and then make your best treatment plan without listening to me tell you what your best treatment plan is. But the book does talk about all the different things that can help. And some things might grab you. I have women say, I didn't think about this on, ever. And then you wrote that. And I was like, that is me. And it's like, well, that's great. Because if that resonates with you, that's something you can do right now. You can find me at healendo.com. I have a pretty popular blog and it's all very free. So $25 for the book, $10 for the ebook. If you can't afford that, just go to the blog. It's all there. It is free and casual. I try to be as upbeat as possible because we have enough in our life and I don't want to be part of the problem of the doom and gloom. I have hope for everyone listening to this podcast. And I'm on, at heal.endo for Instagram.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. I feel like this is an episode to earmark and to listen to a few times because there was so many nuggets, so much information, and really it's the tip of the iceberg. So if you enjoyed this episode, can't recommend your book enough. Definitely check out Heal Endo. And thank you so much for being here.
Oh, a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/545. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Katie. I found it to be extremely informative. Katie is a wealth of knowledge. And if you are looking for a solid endometriosis resource, I highly recommend her book, Heal Endo. Endometriosis is a complex condition that can present in many different ways, with some women experiencing an exceeding amount of pain on a regular basis, and some experiencing silent endo, where they don't necessarily have any obvious symptoms, potentially until they are trying to conceive, and for some reason it's not happening. Diagnosis is one of the biggest challenges for women with endometriosis, as it often and very typically requires a laparoscopic surgical procedure. And even in that case, a skilled and experienced surgeon is required, as not all surgeons have the experience and the ability to accurately detect lesions, depending on how they present upon that laparoscopic procedure. If you know someone who could benefit from hearing today's episode, then I highly encourage you to share it. You'll find the show notes over at fertilityfriday.com/545. With that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. And that's a wrap. If you're loving the Fertility Friday podcast, then I know you'll love FAM, our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Certification Program. It's a 9-month program designed to teach you how to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. The menstrual cycle is the missing piece you've been looking for to better support your clients to balance hormones, normalize their cycles, and optimize their fertility. When you join FAM, I pull back the curtain and share advanced chart interpretation strategies and specialized client protocols that will completely transform your practice. Enrollment for FAM is opening up again in a few months. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMLive to join the waiting list and be the first to know when early bird registration opens. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE.